Hey everybody, welcome back to Tea Talk. We kind of had a couple of weeks off here unexpectedly. So if I sound still a little under the weather, just please forgive me for that. But we're glad to be back, starting back up. And we figured we'd pick back up where we left off. We were planning on talking about depression screenings for that first Tuesday that was missed. We've missed, I believe, 3 Tuesdays. So we're going to pick back up there, as you guys may have seen from the thumbnail. I'm going to give a couple minutes to let those who know that we're back kind of dial in. Forgive the scenery in the background. We were just at a different location today. So you also may see a cat or two kind of come walking by. So I'll introduce them if they come around, but you guys can't see, but my latte, she's over to the left. And we have another cat here named Gilly, and I don't know where she is, but anyway, they may or may not make an appearance. So just beware. And we also have a storm rolling in, and we have a severe thunder and lightning storm. So I'm also hoping, keeping my fingers crossed, that we don't lose power. So if we lose power, it will cut the show. So hopefully that doesn't happen either. And so if you're in the room, go ahead and say hi. Again, if you don't type in the chat, I don't necessarily know you're here. So I know we've got Ricky from sunny Las Vegas. It must be nice. Like I said, we're storming here today, Ricky. So we'll see. But you know what? The rain is good because down in Florida, if it gets, too hot, the grass starts getting brown and burnt and, so we like seeing the nice greenery. So I don't mind the rain. And I don't know what everybody else is having, but tonight I have the Earl Grey tea, and I'll probably sip on it more than usual to try to keep my my voice going. And oh, hi, Lindsay. Yes, happy Tuesday. Happy Tuesday. Glad to be back. Glad to be back. So we've got a couple people rolled in, and I'll just kind of get started, sort of kicking off the show again. We're going to go over depression screenings. Oh, there's Latte. We're going to go over depression screenings, and actually this topic was requested. We got an email to go over depression screenings, documentation requirements, and the coding for it as well. And Lindsay, yeah, I'm feeling better. Not 100%, but a lot better than I was. So thank you for asking. I'm definitely on the road to recovery and getting there. So we'll see. But again, just bear with my voice. So with depression screenings, a little bit of history. I personally believe, and I didn't look up all the facts on this part of it, but I believe that depression screenings started really evolving when, or I should say, kind of coming into the picture, coming into healthcare more when we started with quality care, like moving away from the basic fee-for-service model, and when the carriers started trying to pay based on quality being provided, and then risk adjustment came into the picture because essentially they're trying to control cost. And one of the things that they realized is that depression can actually cause an increase in healthcare cost because it in and of itself, it's, a condition that needs to be treated, but it can also impact a person's ability to take care of themselves and manage their other conditions that they may have. So if it's a person who has multiple chronic conditions and they also are suffering from depression, it can really have a very negative impact on those conditions as well. We all know that like having a positive mindset can help. We've seen that help people that are very ill or like say fight cancer, right? It's like support system and positive attitude can really help. So depression's a big deal. And so depression screenings sort of came into the picture, and they were like, okay, how are we going to determine, if the person needs to be treated or needs to be seen or evaluated by a mental health professional. And so the depression screenings help our providers to gauge that and know if a patient may need some assistance or some referrals. And just like anything, once there is also incentive, more providers, more practices will start actually providing the service because, it's the sort of the way of the world, right? Like you have to keep the doors open. So depression screenings are reimbursable and have gained that popularity. And now, even with commercial carriers, like they cover it, Medicare Advantage plans, Medicare itself. So there are limitations though. So there are some important things to know about the limitations also on payment, frequency. And again, we're going to talk about like what needs to be in the documentation and some of those screening tools that are used. And it looks like we had some more people join. And hi, Aline from rainy Florida. Yes, it's. I don't think we're in the same area. We're not in the same area, but it's raining here. We have a severe thunderstorm warning. So again, you guys, if this cuts out, it could be the storm. So, but anyhow, also remember to put any questions that you have in the chat in regard to the topic, because if you don't ask, I may not say anything about it. So I'm going to do my best to kind of give overall coverage of the depression screenings and how it works, but please remember to ask any questions that you have. So the first bit of advice I would give is if you're a provider or a practice manager and you're looking at, hey, where do I need to go to find some information? Of course, the CMS website is always helpful. But in addition to that, some of your carriers that you have contracts with, you can log into their portals, and a lot of times you'll get some really good information. So I'm going to try to share my screen and just show you guys something that I was able to pull from Blue Cross, one of the Blue Cross carriers. So I'm just going to go back and forth here. So this is a PowerPoint. It's in a PDF format, but this was put together by Blue Cross and Lucid, so lucidhealth.com. But basically on one of the Blue Cross provider sites, you're able to take a look at this entire PowerPoint presentation. So it will go through the nuts and bolts of behavioral health screenings and what have you. And it actually gets pretty interesting with showing you the different types of screening tools that are available. So basically, to start off, if a patient's going to be screened, you want to know what's the coverage, right? So I highly recommend that the team in place take a look at the different carriers and determine what they cover. So for example, if it's a commercial payer or carrier, they probably want a 9,000 CPT code, and that code would be 96127. You'd see it in our thumbnail. So typically those commercial carriers want the 96127. And that's for, a depression screening that can be used for depression screening. And once you plug that in, you can see if it's on your fee schedule for those carriers. And you can also look into coverage information. So some carriers may only cover it once a year. Others, maybe it might be once every 365 days. So there's a difference between like a calendar year and then just like once every 365 days. So calendar year, like each January, 365 days, it has to be literally 365 days from the last time it was performed. So it could be at any time of the year. And they also may have a requirement, like you want to make sure that the diagnosis also goes with the screening code. So there is a Z code. If it is just a screening for depression, there's a code. It's Z13.31, and that's an encounter for screening for depression. So that may be what you would need to use. However, if the patient does have a mental health diagnosis already or a depressive diagnosis, you would want to be specific in also using that as well. And so you can use either one or both, but there is a Z code for it. But you would want to check the limitations from the policy that the patient has and the carrier and the plan to see about the coverage of it. I do know some providers that no matter what, they perform the screening routinely, like they have a routine in place for all of their patients. It's just the way that they do it. And so, I mean, we could talk about that at more length, but they know that there's coverage limitations, but they still want to perform the screening. And you're more than welcome to do that if your practice wants to, but you have to make sure that you also don't continue to bill it inappropriately. So if it's a service that you're performing that you know you're not going to be covered for, there's certain modifiers that may need to be appended to that to let the carrier know that you're expecting denial, that you know that it's not considered medically necessary under their policy and plan. So just make sure you have that in place. But Medicare or Medicare Advantage plans, they want a G code, G0444. So it's a HCPCS code because it's got the G in front of it. And that's also for depression screening. So those are the two codes, the G0444, which would be Medicare, Medicare Advantage, and then 96127, which is for commercial payers. And after that, so you kind of know, okay, first check with the carriers so that you participate with to know what is the guidelines and rules around these depression screenings. What are they going to cover? How many times a year are they going to cover it? So you understand that. And then you'd want to know which code am I supposed to be using for the procedure and then for the diagnosis. After that, one of the most important things is knowing which screening tool you're going to use. So when we think about like depression and providers and visits, you may, of course you may think like, well, they could just ask you questions, and they certainly can, and many do. So some providers may just not use a screening tool and just ask you, are you feeling down? Are you feeling sad? Are you, having like lack of motivation, all of that. But if they're just asking these questions and working around trying to find out the, mental state, and they're not using a standardized tool, you would not use one of those depression screening codes. Those codes do require the use of a standardized tool, an evidence-based tool. And there are multiple evidence-based tools that they can use for the screenings. So I'm going to go ahead and click back over. So One of them, let me try to make this a little bit bigger for you guys. One of them is the PHQ-2 is what it's known as, and that's one type of screening. So it's literally 2 questions, but it is a screening tool. It's, not obviously very detailed at all. But it technically is an evidence-based and tool that is standard. And this tool itself is a first step approach. You'll kind of see that in there. So those who have a positive finding from these questions, you would actually need to the provider would need to have them further evaluated with the PHQ-9. So that is this tool here. So this is just an example of the beginning of it here. But these tools also, let me just remove that for a second. These tools also, some practices are able to actually get them embedded into their software, which is fine. So if you have, your medical record that you can build the screening in, that's okay too. But the screening does need to actually be there in the record and be available. So let's see. Here's the other page, so the end of the 9 questions, and at the end of this, it tells you how to score it. So there's more information about the actual scoring. There's also an anxiety screening tool. So there's several standardized tools for behavioral health, and that would apply to the G0444 and 96127. So typically, though, we see the PHQ-9 most often being used. And so when the PHQ-9 is used, that the actual screening itself, so the questions and the answers, need to be in the medical record. So you would need to be able to produce those in an audit situation. So you need to be able to show the questions that were asked and the answer that was provided by the patient. We would need to be able to see the scoring that is, typically at the bottom of the PHQ-9. And then last but not least, as far as the documentation is concerned, the provider that then sees the patient after the screening has been performed would need an interpretation. So they would need to elaborate on that test and the findings in the medical record, in the note. So it's sort of like any other test that the patient would have done, right? So let's say they have an X-ray. The image that's taken, the picture, would be the same as the PHQ-9 form, right? And then when a radiologist reads the film, they write a report. So the provider documenting, so the PA, ARNP, or nurse practitioner, or the MD or the DO, when they document in the note, they would need to document their interpretation, so their findings based on the scoring of that PHQ-9 or whatever standardized tool the practice uses. And if follow-up is required or necessary and they document that, we'd want to see a plan in there. What's the next step? So we need both the document filled out, so the questionnaire, the depression screening, and that needs to be available in the record to where it's attached to the patient's chart. It should be dated as well. Don't forget that. So we need that document as well as the provider's interpretation and plan. If it's normal, obviously the plan just may be to repeat in whatever it is, like 1 year from that point of time, or sooner if needed for whatever reason. But the document needs to be there, as well as documentation within the record of the result. So just having the screening filled out is not going to support the reporting, the coding of it. So many practices started including like the PHQ-9 in the packet, like when the patient checks in, they hand it to them and they fill it out, and then turn it back in and they just scan it in, but didn't go any further than that. So again, if there's no interpretation of it, if the provider isn't actually reviewing it, discussing it with the patient if needed, it's not going to satisfy those requirements. So there's that interpretation piece that's needed. And we can't just assume, just based on the scoring, what the provider's judgment is. The screenings are just that, they're screenings. So they're not the end all be all for the official or unofficial diagnosis. A screening basically allows the provider to uncover if there's risk there for that patient for the particular condition that they're being screened for, but they need to make that final determination and diagnosis, and it needs to be documented in the record to support those codes. So there's also going to be, again, some documentation and coding guidance that you should be able to find with your carriers in regard to depression screening. So I'm not sure if anybody has looked into that yet, but in a second here, I'm going to go ahead and pull up an example for you guys. Okay, so again, this is another, I was in Blue Cross, so this is another Blue Cross example, I believe. And they actually had a document for documentation and coding guide for depression-related conditions. So this talks about how it's important to document and code depression-related conditions and that they need to be accurate. This gets pretty specific into documenting the depression itself. So let's talk about that for a quick second. So once the providers get into understanding, like, okay, we have the screening ability, this is the screening that we're using, the standardized tool that we're using. Okay, the patient needs to fill this tool out. I'm going to review the scoring, review the patient's responses, document my interpretation in the note. And let's say that there is a diagnosis of some form of depression or depression-related condition. The next step is the providers typically have a lot of questions on, well, how do I document this right? How do I know what I'm doing as far as like what's needed in like the assessment and plan? How detailed do I need to be? Well, the electronic records now typically push the providers to select a diagnosis code that then has the description attached to it. That's good and bad, right? So the good thing is it's actually should be the official description of the code that they're selecting. And I say should be because I have actually encountered instances where a practice has like allowed permissions to people where the ICD-10 description could be changed. It could be altered. And that gets a little bit tricky and usually ends up being a big problem. It's usually more of a problem than a help, because when somebody changes the description to something that they remember or they think of or that they understand it to be, it could mean something completely different to another, or someone else just then gets into the habit of using it. So their documentation may not actually support like what that code is. So I do not recommend making any changes to the official descriptors of the codes that are in the electronic record. I'd leave those alone. It really just creates problems, especially when it's a multi-provider practice. And for providers who do not have a high level of knowledge of the technical parts of coding, it just makes it confusing. So the good thing about those technical descriptions being in there is it's going to give you the full description of the code, which then should be a complete description. So then it just comes down to which one do you choose? And so from a time perspective, the challenge there is the providers feeling that they don't have the time to kind of dig through and know, like find the one that they're actually looking for or that actually applies to the patient. So that can be super tricky. Many practices have had success with picking certain diagnoses that are challenging, such as depression, major depressive disorder, for example, and creating small cards for providers and laminated, and it being like whatever the code of the month or the code of the quarter, where they learn the concept about how the code breaks down so that they know more about which code is appropriate in which situation. Same thing they might do also with like diabetes, for example, because there's so many diabetic codes. So if you have a larger practice and you're trying to get providers to be more accurate in that way, you would want to make sure that you highlight like again a code of the month or a code of the quarter and work on getting educational materials out. And again, let me show you these documents can be helpful from the carrier. So you'd want your team, that's your billing and coding team, or your compliance team, if you have one, to be involved in reviewing this information and then pushing out some educational material for that code that, or the section of codes that you're trying to get the providers to get used to. And so giving them the information is the first step. So for depression, we need to know the episode of depression. For major depression in particular also, is it a single episode or a recurrent episode? And then the severity, is it mild, moderate, or severe? And then if it is severe, is it with or without psychotic features? And then what's the status of it? Is it not in remission, or is it in partial remission or full remission? And then the treatment plan should be documented. Now, I've actually gotten a lot of questions from providers about asking for more detailed information specifically about those elements. So they may say, well, how do I know? Like, what does episode mean? Like single episode versus recurrent. And I know there may be some providers on here or that listen to this episode that say, well, geez, you should know that. But just remember that this could be multiple specialties may end up doing some of these screenings. So it may be, or, even a new provider coming on. So this is where, education again is super important, and having the team in place that can help those providers that aren't familiar with some of those concepts for some of these conditions to get more comfortable. And so then using like the DSM-5 to kind of look at, hey, what is the clinical criteria for this diagnosis? And how do we make sure that we're describing it correctly, that we're selecting the right code. And so once they get through the episode being single or recurrent, so single is like the first one time, recurrent is, hey, this has happened before, it's now a recurrent episode. Then typically we talk about severity. Well, is it mild, is it moderate, or is it severe? And again, if it's severe, is it with or without psychotic features? So again, there's very specific diagnostic criteria that they would need to use to determine that severity and also the status of them being either not in remission at all or in partial remission or full remission. And this talk isn't meant to be a clinical one. And so if anybody has a request for that, I would gladly try to accommodate that. But I also love for any like clinical conversation to have a clinician then present on the Tea Talk. So we'll see in the future if anybody has any questions like that, we can dig into that. One tool though that is super helpful and that I have actually referred to some providers, this is kind of oddly, is Codify through the AAPC. So Codify is actually relatively inexpensive for a monthly subscription, or even if you pay for it annually. And when you go into Codify, you can look up different codes, whether it be CPT or ICD-10. And so if you look up the depression codes in that section, they actually have a box that you can click, and it says clinical condition. And it gives you a lot of information about that specific clinical condition, and even the DSM-5 information many times. And it does do that for depression. And so I have seen it actually really help providers also that are not super familiar with the diagnosis, but want to learn more, want to know more, and want a quick reference, or just like cross-check themselves or get a better understanding for how these codes are broken down. So Codify can actually be really helpful for that. And it's a more reasonable tool price-wise, because I know that there's other coding tools out there, but many of them are like super, super expensive. So especially for the smaller practices that, may not have as much, financial resources to kind of invest in, like Encoder Pro or what have you, those are usually quite a bit more expensive. But the Codify is actually pretty darn good. And it does have information in there that can help to break down some of that clinical information. So, and even these worksheets, let me go back to kind of show you, they even have a bit of an explanation in them. So it says an individual can only have one single depressive episode during his or her lifetime, which may be in partial remission with ongoing treatment for many years. If the single episode resolves and no longer requires treatment, any new episodes for depression would be considered recurrent. So again, this gives them the breakdown for that. And then 2 months with no symptoms or the near absence of symptoms is generally regarded as defining remission from the depressive episode. And then document patient's depression, even if the manifestations are well controlled with medication or active psychotherapy. So that's another, I'm going to scroll down here and then kind of come back. That's another key thing, is that sometimes the providers say, well, somebody else is treating that, or they're taking meds, and, but if the condition is still being treated, it's still present. Again, they may be in some kind of remission, but, you still want to document as the provider anything that is impacting your care during that encounter. So anything that impacts your decision-making during an encounter, you want to document well. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to impact or change your level of service. It may, but in order for it to impact your level of service, you would either need to be evaluating or treating it. And so the documentation, again, would just need to be supportive of that. But again, any condition that's impacting your care during that encounter, you will want to make sure that you're documenting. If you're not, then you are just missing an opportunity there to show that complexity of care that you're providing to the patients during the encounter. This sheet also gives some more coding tips. It gives some codes listed that the providers can use. Again, it's helpful in the beginning for them to see the different options, and even to get like a little cheat sheet coding card with the full descriptions on there to get providers used to the different breakdowns. But having that education on top of it is important. I don't want to lead you down the wrong path there, because just giving a coding card is not the solution, because there are so many codes available that if they just limit their knowledge to just what's on that coding card, again, they could use the wrong condition for the patient. But it's a step with education. It's a step in the right direction, and getting them to know more about how those codes work and how they break down. And so that again is some Blue Cross information. So you guys, whatever carriers you're contracted with, you'll most likely have a login, username and login for your practice, for your providers. And there is typically a lot of educational material that they place on their sites that you can dig into. It's kind of a gold mine for, free educational material. But again, I recommend you have your coding team and compliance team look at it. Don't take it all for granted, or just assume that everything in there is perfect, because they do make mistakes as well. So take your time, take a look, have your team go through it, and make your decisions there. So I think that pretty much sums up depression screenings. And again, if you guys have any more specific questions, you can feel free to ask in the chat if you're live right now. But also, just a reminder, we do have an email address. We have ttalk@stalkinghorsellc.com. And that email address is open to everyone. So if you have a specific question or concern or need, you can email that address, and we'll make sure we address your concern or question or topic on Tea Talk. And if for some reason you want to see what other information we have or check out our website, you can go to stalkinghorsellc.com. You'll see information on there about some of the Tea Talk episodes. You'll also have ways to contact us on that website. We do have some webinars available on there, so you can check out our website as well. And don't forget to join the herd. So you can like us on Facebook. You can like this actual episode, which would be great. Just give us that thumbs up. And we are also on Instagram. We're on LinkedIn. And you can subscribe to this channel if you're not already subscribed. And follow us on all social media. And again, this is all designed for you guys in the healthcare community. So we're going to keep doing this Tea Talk for as long as possible. And as long as you guys keep coming in with suggestions and questions and commenting and building this community, we will keep doing it. So we appreciate that. I know some of the people that have joined Tea Talk have connected outside of the episodes, which is great, and that's really what it's for. So, oh yeah, hi. Looks like we had Vin drop in. Yeah, 120 degrees. I think you're in Vegas as well, if I read that right through the chat. And I heard that you guys have had those record high heats. That's insane. I can tell you here, sometimes I feel like it's 120 degrees with that humidity and everything, but actually being 120, I think my shoes may melt on the pavement. That's hot. So try to stay cool there. But I know you guys get, actually, it's sort of weird, right? Because everybody thinks the desert would probably be like super hot all the time, but you guys get colder in the winter than we do here. Oh, okay. So Ricky, you think it's much hotter in Florida? Well, it feels like it. I think it's the humidity. It's honestly that humidity that will get you every time. It's no joke. but we have swimming pools too. So I know you guys do as well, but well, you get the casinos too. But those casinos are getting some really high electric bills now with that AC running. So, man, well, stay cool there, and we'll try to do that here too. I know it's only 7:40, but I don't see any questions coming through the chat here in the comments in regard to depression screening. So I think, hopefully, fingers crossed, I did a pretty good job covering it. If again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to our next Tea Talk, and we're so glad to be back, and I'm happy to be on the mend. So anyway, if you guys think of any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I will see you next Tuesday.